I was 14 when I first stepped onto a stage, and I remember the exact moment I knew what I wanted to do with my life. It wasn't a gradual realization or a childhood fantasy that had been building for years. It was instant, almost violent in its clarity. I was standing in the wings of our middle school auditorium during a production of Our Town, waiting for my 30-second appearance as townsperson number 3, and I could hear the lead actor delivering his lines. The audience was completely silent, absorbed, and I realized that for those 2 hours, everyone in that room was living inside a story that we were creating for them. That kind of power, the ability to make people feel something, to transport them somewhere else, that was what I wanted. My parents were supportive in that vague, well-meaning way that parents are when their child announces a dream that seems impractical but harmless. My father was an accountant, my mother a dental hygienist. They were good people who had built a comfortable middle-class life in suburban Ohio through steady work and careful planning. Acting wasn't something that fit into their understanding of how the world worked, but they figured I'd grow out of it or find some compromise, like teaching drama at a local school. I didn't plan to compromise. From the moment I discovered theater, I consumed everything I could find. I read plays constantly: Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, Sam Shepard, contemporary stuff I found in the library. I watched every movie I could get my hands on, studying performances frame by frame. I took every drama elective my high school offered and volunteered for every production, no matter how small the role. I wasn't naturally charismatic or particularly good-looking. I was average height, average build, with the kind of face that people described as pleasant or friendly. But I worked harder than anyone else, and I truly believed, that dedication could overcome any limitation. Riverside High School had a surprisingly robust theater program, mostly due to one man, Gregory Wallace. He'd been teaching there for almost 20 years, and in that time, he'd built the drama department into something that rivaled programs at much wealthier schools. He directed all the major productions, ran the drama club, and taught the advanced acting classes. He had connections to regional theaters, relationships with college admissions officers, and a reputation that extended well beyond our small town. If you were serious about theater and you went to Riverside, everything flowed through Gregory Wallace. I first met him at the beginning of my sophomore year, when I auditioned for the fall production of The Crucible. The auditions were held in the Black Box Theater, a converted classroom that Wallace had fought the school board to create. About 30 students showed up, ranging from experienced seniors to nervous freshmen. Wallace sat in the center of the room with a yellow legal pad, watching each of us perform our prepared monologues. He was in his mid-40s then. With graying hair he wore slightly too long and a deliberate way of speaking that made everything sound profound. He dressed like he thought a theater director should dress: black turtlenecks, corduroy jackets, scarves even when it wasn't particularly cold. When my turn came, I performed a monologue from Death of a Salesman. I'd practiced it for weeks, worked on every inflection and gesture. I thought I did well. Wallace watched without expression, made a few notes, and said, "Thank you, next please." I got cast as one of the townspeople, a non-speaking role. I told myself it was because I was only a sophomore, that I needed to pay my dues. I showed up to every rehearsal early, stayed late, watched how the leads worked. I studied Wallace's directing style, the way he could pull performances out of students by asking the right questions or making them uncomfortable in productive ways. He was talented. There was no question about that. He could take a mediocre scene and find the emotional truth in it, could coach a nervous actor into giving a genuine performance. Junior year, I auditioned for A Streetcar Named Desire. I'd prepared Stanley's monologue about the Napoleonic Code, had worked with a private coach I'd found through a community theater in the next town over, paying for the sessions with money from my part-time job at a grocery store. This time, I felt confident. This time, I knew I was ready. Wallace cast Brandon Simmons as Stanley. Brandon was a senior, tall and athletic, with the kind of easy confidence that came from being popular and successful at everything he tried. He was a good actor, I'll give him that. But he hadn't worked for it the way I had. For him, it was just another activity, something to put on his college applications alongside basketball and student government. For me, it was everything. I got cast as the newspaper boy, one line. I should have seen the pattern then, but I convinced myself that Wallace was teaching me patience, that this was part of the process. Other teachers at school told me I had talent. The drama coach at a local community theater where I volunteered had encouraged me to pursue acting seriously. But Wallace's opinion was the one that mattered, because Wallace was the gatekeeper to everything I needed. The lead roles that would build my resume, the recommendation letters that would get me into a good theater program, the connections that could launch a career. Senior year was supposed to be different. Senior year was when everything would finally come together. The fall production was Hamlet, and I absolutely knew, that I was going to play the lead. I'd spent the entire summer preparing. I'd read every major interpretation of the character, watched every filmed version I could find, analyzed the text until I could recite most of the play from memory. I'd worked with my coach twice a week, refining my audition monologue. I'd even attended a Shakespeare workshop at a nearby college, spending money I'd saved from 2 years of working weekends. The audition was in early September, right after school started. The Black Box Theater was packed. Almost every theater student in the school wanted a role in Hamlet, even the freshmen who knew they had no shot at anything major. I'd drawn a late slot in the audition order, which I told myself was good because Wallace would be warmed up by then, more receptive. I performed To Be or Not to Be. I know everyone does that monologue, that it's almost cliché, but I'd found something in it that felt true to me. I wasn't playing it as philosophical contemplation, but as genuine, immediate desperation, a person actually considering whether continuing to exist was worth the pain. When I finished, there was a moment of silence in the room. I could feel that I'd landed something real. Wallace looked up from his legal pad. "Interesting choice," he said. His tone was neutral, but there was something in his expression I couldn't read. Very earnest. "Thank you," I said, not sure if it was actually a compliment. "Tell me," Wallace continued, leaning back in his chair, "why do you want to play Hamlet?" It was a question he'd never asked anyone else that afternoon. I felt the entire room watching me. "Because I understand him," I said. "I understand what it's like to feel like you're supposed to be something, but you can't figure out how to become it. To feel like you're failing at something that should be fundamental." Wallace nodded slowly. "That's honest. I appreciate that." He made a note on his pad. "Next, please." The cast list went up 3 days later. I'd made myself wait until after school to check it, not wanting to seem desperate by crowding around the bulletin board with everyone else during lunch. When I finally walked down the hallway to where Wallace had posted the list, there was only one other person there, a freshman girl who squealed when she saw she'd gotten a serving woman role. I scanned the list. Cameron Graham was playing Hamlet. Cameron was a junior, a decent actor with a good voice, but no particular connection to the material. He was reliable, easy to direct, and came from a family that donated generously to the school's arts programs. I was cast as Rosencrantz. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Not even Horatio, not even Laertes. Rosencrantz, a character so interchangeable with Guildenstern that Shakespeare barely bothered to differentiate them. A sycophant, a tool, a nothing role. I went to Wallace's office the next morning before school started. He was at his desk, marking up a script, and looked up when I knocked on the open door. "Can I talk to you about the casting?" I asked. Of course, come in. I sat down across from him. His office was small, cluttered with playbills and books and framed photographs of past productions. I wanted to ask about Hamlet, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I thought my audition went well. Your audition was fine, Wallace said. Technically proficient, you clearly prepared. Then why didn't I get the role, or at least something more substantial? Wallace put down his pen and looked at me with an expression that was almost sympathetic. Can I be honest with you? Please. You have a forgettable face. The words just hung there in the air between us. I felt like I'd been physically hit. Wallace continued, his tone almost gentle, like he was doing me a favor by explaining this. Acting isn't just about skill or preparation. There's an X factor, a presence that some people have and others don't. You're competent, but you don't command attention. You don't make people want to watch you. And in theater, especially at a competitive level, that matters more than how many hours you put in or how well you understand the character. I could develop that, I said. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. With the right opportunities— You're a senior, Wallace interrupted. This is your last year here. I need to cast roles with an eye toward building the program for the future. Cameron is a junior. He'll be here another year, and he has the kind of natural stage presence that will draw audiences. That's the reality of this business. What about my college applications? I need strong roles to submit with my portfolio. Wallace leaned back in his chair. I'll be honest with you about that too. I don't think you should pursue theater in college, not seriously. You could minor in it, maybe, do community theater on the side. But as a career path, you'll spend years struggling, fighting for every audition, and the odds are overwhelming that you won't make it. You'll end up teaching high school drama or waiting tables in New York, wondering why you wasted your 20s chasing something that was never realistic. I couldn't speak. I felt paralyzed. I know that's hard to hear, Wallace said, but I'd be doing you a disservice if I let you believe something that isn't true. You're a smart kid. You have good grades. You could do well in any number of fields. Why limit yourself to something where you're always going to be fighting against your natural limitations? I left his office in a daze. I went through that entire day mechanically, not really present in any of my classes. My friends asked me about the cast list, offered sympathy about Rosencrantz, but I couldn't engage with them. All I could hear was Wallace's voice saying, "Forgettable face," over and over in my head. I considered quitting the production, but I knew that would only prove Wallace right, that I couldn't handle disappointment, that I didn't have what it took. So I showed up to rehearsals and said my lines and tried to find something to work with in a role that barely existed. I watched Cameron fumble through Hamlet's depths, settling for surface-level interpretations that got the meaning across without digging into anything real. Wallace worked with him patiently, encouragingly, never demanding more than Cameron was capable of giving. The real blow came in October, when I got my progress report for advanced drama. I'd always gotten A's in Wallace's classes. My work ethic alone had guaranteed that. But this time, I was looking at a B+. I stayed after class to ask about it. Wallace was straightening chairs in the black box theater, and he barely looked up when I approached. "The B+?" I asked. "Is that a mistake?" "No mistake," Wallace said. "Your in-class scene work has been inconsistent. You're technically sound, but you're not taking risks, not showing me anything new. A B+ is a good grade. You should be happy with it. But I need A's for my transcript, for college applications." "Then you should work harder," Wallace said simply. "Show me something that deserves an A." I did work harder. I stayed after rehearsals to run extra scenes. I asked for feedback constantly. I volunteered for every in-class exercise. But when the quarter grades came out in November, I had another B+. My GPA, which had been a 4.0, dropped to a 3.96. Not devastating, but noticeable, enough to raise questions. The applications for theater programs were due in December and early January. I was applying to 6 schools, a mix of conservatories and university programs, each with their own requirements and audition processes. Every single one required a recommendation letter from a drama teacher or director. I asked Wallace for the letter in mid-November, giving him what I thought was plenty of time. He agreed, told me to send him the forms and he'd take care of it. I found out what he'd written in March, when I'd been rejected from every single program I'd applied to. One of the schools, a mid-tier university in Pennsylvania that I'd considered a safety school, sent me a copy of my application file at my request. Wallace's letter was in there. It was professional, carefully worded to avoid anything that could be considered a lie. He noted my dedication and work ethic. He mentioned that I'd been involved in every production during my time at Riverside. He described me as a reliable ensemble member who takes direction well, and then, in the 3rd paragraph, while he has shown consistent commitment to theater, I have some concerns about his suitability for intensive performance programs. His natural affect tends toward the subdued, and he has struggled to develop the kind of commanding stage presence that successful actors typically possess. He may find more fulfillment in academic approaches to theater, such as dramaturgy or theater history, rather than performance-focused training. It was a rejection letter disguised as a recommendation. Any admissions officer reading it would understand exactly what Wallace was saying. This student isn't good enough. Don't waste a slot on him. I sat in my bedroom with that letter for hours, reading it over and over. My parents were at work. The house was completely silent. I felt something breaking inside me, some fundamental belief about how the world worked. I'd thought that if you wanted something badly enough, if you worked hard enough, if you were willing to sacrifice and push yourself, you could achieve it. I'd thought that dedication mattered, that adults like Wallace were supposed to help you reach your potential, not actively sabotage you. I'd been naive. The worst part was that I couldn't even confront him about it. What would I say? The letter wasn't factually wrong. I hadn't been given opportunities to develop a commanding stage presence because I'd been cast in nothing roles. My subdued affect was at least partially the result of being systematically discouraged and undermined for 2 years. But none of that mattered. Wallace had the credibility, the reputation, the authority. I was just a high school senior with hurt feelings. Hamlet opened in late March. I stood backstage in my costume, watching Cameron deliver To Be or Not to Be with competent blandness, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no jealousy, no sadness, just emptiness. This thing that had been the center of my life, this dream that had defined me, was over. Wallace had killed it as thoroughly as if he'd taken a physical weapon to it. The show ran for 2 weekends. People told me I did a good job with Rosencrantz. I smiled and thanked them. After the final performance, there was a cast party at Cameron's house. I didn't go. I drove home, took off my costume for the last time, and started thinking about what came next. I had good grades in everything except Wallace's class. I had high SAT scores. I could still get into a decent college, just not for theater. My parents had been gently suggesting that I consider something more practical for years. Now seemed like the time to listen to them. I'd always been good at science. Biology and chemistry made sense to me in a way that had nothing to do with natural talent or presence, or any of the intangible qualities that Wallace claimed I lacked. In science, there were right answers. There were procedures and protocols. If you learned them, if you followed them precisely, you got results. No one could take that away from you because they didn't like your face. In April, I applied to a state university with a strong pre-med program and got accepted. I told my parents I wanted to become a doctor. They were thrilled. Everyone was proud of me for being realistic and mature. No one knew that I'd been pushed into this decision, that it was a second choice, a consolation prize for a future that had been stolen from me. I graduated in May. Wallace gave a speech at the senior assembly about following your dreams and believing in yourself. I sat in the audience and felt nothing but contempt. At graduation rehearsal, he pulled me aside and told me he was proud of me for making a smart choice about my future. I thanked him and walked away before I said something I'd regret. That summer, I worked full-time at the grocery store, saving money for college. I didn't see any plays. I didn't watch movies. I packed everything theater-related that I owned, scripts, books, notes from acting classes, into boxes and put them in my parents' basement. I told myself I was closing a chapter, moving forward, being adult about disappointment. Really, I was just numb. College started in August. The university was 3 hours from home, big enough that I could disappear into it, remake myself into someone who'd never wanted anything as foolish as a career in theater. I declared a biology major, signed up for the required pre-med courses, and threw myself into studying with the same obsessive focus I'd once brought to theater. The work was brutal. Organic chemistry, physics, calculus, classes designed to weed out students who weren't serious, who couldn't handle the pressure. I watched classmates drop out of pre-med after the first round of midterms, switching to easier majors or leaving school entirely. I stayed. I studied 12, 14, 16 hours a day. I memorized every reaction mechanism, every formula, every biological pathway. I earned A's not through natural ability, but through sheer, grinding persistence. I barely slept. I barely socialized. I joined no clubs, attended no parties, made no real friends. When people asked why I wanted to be a doctor, I gave them the standard answers about helping people and making a difference. The truth was simpler. I wanted to be exceptional at something that couldn't be taken away from me on someone's whim. My sophomore year, I started volunteering at the university hospital, doing the basic work that pre-med students do, shadowing doctors, helping with patient intake, cleaning rooms. I hated it at first. The hospital was depressing, full of suffering and fear, and the smell of disinfectant barely covering something worse. But I kept showing up, kept observing, and slowly I began to understand what medicine actually was. It was performance, just like theater. When a doctor walked into a room, they were playing a role. The authority figure, the person who had answers, the one who could save you. Patients needed to believe in that performance as much as any audience needed to believe in a play. The difference was that in medicine, the performance had actual consequences. If you did it well, people lived. If you failed, they died. That realization changed something in me. I stopped thinking of medicine as a backup plan and started seeing it as something that could be mine, in a way that theater never really had been. I could be exceptional at this. I could build expertise that was undeniable, measurable, beyond anyone's subjective judgment. Junior year, I took my MCAT and scored in the 98th percentile. I'd studied for 6 months, taken every practice test I could find, memorized thousands of flashcards. The score was proof, not of natural ability, but of what I could accomplish through pure determination. I applied to medical schools in the fall of my senior year. This time, I didn't need Gregory Wallace's recommendation. I didn't need anyone to vouch for my natural presence or commanding personality. I had a 3.94 GPA, a near-perfect MCAT score, hundreds of hours of clinical experience, and research publications in cellular biology. The only thing that mattered was what I'd achieved. I got into 7 of the 9 schools I applied to, including one top-tier program in Chicago. I accepted that offer. When I called my parents to tell them, I could hear the pride in their voices, the relief that I'd found my path after the disappointment with theater. They still thought of it that way, a disappointment, a phase I'd grown out of. They didn't understand that I thought about Wallace every single day, that every A I earned, every exam I aced, every piece of recognition I received was another small piece of proof that he'd been wrong about me. Medical school was harder than anything I'd experienced. The sheer volume of information we were expected to master was overwhelming. Anatomy, pharmacology, pathology, dozens of diseases and conditions and treatment protocols. The first year was entirely classroom-based, 16-hour days of lectures and study groups and practice exams. Students had mental breakdowns. Relationships fell apart. People dropped out. I thrived. I discovered that I had an almost photographic memory for visual information, especially spatial relationships. I could look at an anatomy atlas once and remember the exact position of every blood vessel, every nerve pathway. During gross anatomy lab, where we spent months dissecting cadavers, I became known for being able to identify structures instantly, to trace connections that other students struggled to see. Second year brought clinical rotations, actual work in hospitals, treating real patients under supervision. This was where a lot of students faltered, discovering that academic excellence didn't translate to practical skill. I found the opposite was true. In the controlled environment of a hospital, with clear protocols and established procedures, I was completely comfortable. I was good with patients, able to project the calm authority that made them trust me, even when I was a 24-year-old student who barely knew what he was doing. My third year, I did a rotation in cardiothoracic surgery and found what I'd been looking for without knowing I was searching for it. Cardiac surgery was the most technically demanding field in medicine, requiring a combination of precise manual skill, spatial reasoning, and absolute emotional control. Surgeons spent years mastering techniques that had zero margin for error. One wrong cut, one moment of hesitation, and a patient died on the table. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was mine. I matched into a cardiac surgery residency at a major teaching hospital in Boston. Residency made medical school look easy. We worked 100-hour weeks, sometimes more. We were on call every third night, sleeping in brief stretches between emergencies. We assisted on surgeries, learned to make incisions and tie sutures and manipulate tissue without causing damage. We made mistakes and watched people die and came back the next day to try again. The attending surgeons were brutal. They screamed at residents who made errors, humiliated them in front of other staff, dismissed anyone who showed weakness. It was hazing, pure and simple, a test to see who could endure the pressure. A lot of residents quit. Some switched to easier specialties. A few had complete breakdowns. I never considered leaving. Every time an attending tore into me for being too slow or too hesitant. Every time I spent 36 hours straight on my feet without sleep. Every time I held a human heart in my hands and felt it beating against my palms. All of it felt like I was building something permanent, something that belonged to me alone. I was 27 years old, and I hadn't been on a date in 3 years. I had no hobbies. I rarely saw my parents. I couldn't remember the last time I'd watched a movie or read anything that wasn't a medical journal. The person I'd been at 17, the kid who cried during powerful theater performances, who dreamed of making audiences feel something, that person was gone, buried under years of discipline and control, and the absolute refusal to want anything I couldn't achieve through my own skill. In my 4th year of residency, I assisted on my first solo coronary bypass. The attending surgeon, a 60-year-old cardiac legend named Dr. Harrison Matthews, stepped back and let me do the entire procedure while he observed. It was a routine case, relatively simple by cardiac standards, but my hands were steady. I made every cut precisely, connected every graft correctly, and when I restarted the patient's heart and watched it begin beating on its own again, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not joy exactly, but satisfaction. Proof. Evidence that I was exactly what I'd made myself become. Dr. Matthews nodded when I finished. "Good work," he said. Coming from him, that was high praise. I completed my residency at 31 and took a fellowship position focusing on congenital heart defects in children. This was the most specialized, most difficult work in cardiac surgery, repairing malformed hearts in patients who weighed as little as 5 or 6 pounds, where every structure was millimeters across and the slightest error meant death. Only a handful of surgeons in the country were truly expert in it. I spent 3 years in that fellowship, working with a team at a children's hospital that saw the most complex cases from across the region. I learned to repair hearts that had formed incorrectly in the womb, to reroute blood vessels, to reconstruct chambers that barely existed. I operated on newborns, toddlers, teenagers. I saved most of them. I lost some. Every death haunted me, but I never let it show. You couldn't afford to, not in this field. By the time I was 34, I was hired as an attending surgeon at a major pediatric cardiac center in Ohio, not far from where I'd grown up, though I rarely went back to my hometown. I had a national reputation among specialists. Other surgeons referred their most difficult cases to me. I published research, trained residents, and refined techniques that incrementally improved survival rates for operations that had previously been considered nearly impossible. I made excellent money, though I barely spent any of it. I lived in a modest apartment, drove a practical car, owned almost nothing. I worked 70-hour weeks because that was normal for someone at my level. I had colleagues, but no real friends. I dated occasionally over the years. Brief relationships that ended when it became clear I had nothing to offer emotionally, that I was too controlled, too distant, too obsessed with work to be an actual partner. I didn't care. I'd built a life where my value was objective, measurable, beyond dispute. I was one of the best pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country. That was worth more than companionship or happiness or any of the things normal people wanted. I thought about Gregory Wallace sometimes, usually late at night when I couldn't sleep, which was often. I wondered if he was still teaching at Riverside, still crushing students who dreamed of more than he thought they deserved. I imagined running into him someday and having him realize what I'd become, seeing the recognition in his eyes that he'd been wrong. It was a petty fantasy, and I knew it, but I let myself have it. I never expected the fantasy to become real. It happened on a Tuesday in March when I was 37 years old. I was in my office between surgeries, reviewing scans for an upcoming case, when my surgical coordinator knocked on the door. "Dr. Porter, there's a new patient consult I need you to look at. 5-year-old boy, complex congenital defect. The family was referred from Cincinnati. They're asking specifically for you." This wasn't unusual. I got referrals from across the region, sometimes from across the country. I took the file from her and started reading. The patient was Owen Wallace, age 5. He'd been born with a rare condition called tetralogy of Fallot, with pulmonary atresia. Essentially, his pulmonary artery had never fully developed, and his heart had formed with multiple defects that prevented proper blood flow to his lungs. He'd undergone 2 palliative surgeries as an infant to keep him alive, but now he needed a complete repair, a complex operation that would involve reconstructing major blood vessels and repairing the internal structure of his heart. I'd done this surgery maybe a dozen times. The success rate was around 70%, and the patients who survived often needed multiple follow-up procedures. It was as challenging as pediatric cardiac surgery got. I flipped to the family information page. Father, Gregory Wallace, age 53. Occupation, theater director/instructor. Mother, Catherine Wallace, age 48. Occupation, graphic designer. I stopped breathing for a moment. Then I read it again, slower, making sure I wasn't misreading the name. Gregory Wallace. It had to be him. The age was right. Theater director, that fit. And this was Ohio, less than an hour from where I'd grown up. I sat there staring at the file for a long time. My coordinator was still waiting in the doorway. "When are they scheduled to come in?" I asked. My voice sounded normal to my own ears, perfectly controlled. "Thursday at 2. They want to meet with you before committing to the surgery." "Schedule it," I said, "and make sure I have at least an hour blocked out." She nodded and left. I turned back to the file and started reading in earnest, forcing myself to focus on the medical details. Owen had been followed by pediatric cardiologists since birth. His condition was stable now, but deteriorating. Without the surgery, he had maybe 2 years, possibly less. With the surgery, assuming it went well, he could live a relatively normal life. I'd make sure the surgery went well. Whatever I felt about Gregory Wallace, I would save his son. That was my job, my purpose, the thing I'd built my entire identity around. I wouldn't let a 5-year-old child suffer because of something his father had done 20 years ago. But after the surgery, after I'd given Wallace his son's life back, that was when I'd make sure he understood exactly who had done it and what it meant. Thursday arrived. I cleared my afternoon schedule and asked my coordinator to bring the Wallace family to my office rather than one of the consultation rooms. I wanted this meeting to happen on my territory, in the space where my credentials were visible, the diplomas on the wall, the awards, the published papers, all the evidence of what I'd become. They arrived exactly on time. My coordinator opened the door and showed them in. A woman in her late 40s, with careful posture and tired eyes. A small boy who looked pale and thin, and Gregory Wallace. He'd aged. His hair was mostly gray now, worn shorter than he'd kept it at Riverside. He'd put on weight, developed the soft look of someone who spent their life indoors. He was wearing a sport coat over a button-down shirt, still trying to project that artistic, intellectual image. When he looked at me, there was no recognition in his face, just the anxious hopefulness of a father whose child was dying. I stood up and shook his hand, then Catherine's. I smiled at Owen and asked him if he wanted to sit in the big chair behind my desk. He did shyly, and his mother helped him up. "Thank you for seeing us," Catherine said. "We've been told you're the best for this kind of surgery." "I've done a number of these procedures," I said, sitting down across from them. "But I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what's involved and what the realistic outcomes are." I walked them through it, the surgical approach, the risks, the recovery timeline. I used the same calm, authoritative tone I used with every family, the one that said I knew what I was doing, that they could trust me. Wallace listened intently, asking occasional questions that suggested he'd done his research. Catherine was quieter, occasionally glancing at Owen to make sure he wasn't too scared by the discussion. "The success rate is around 70%, I said. "That's not as high as we'd like, but given the complexity of Owen's anatomy, it's realistic. If the surgery goes well, he'll need follow-up care for years, possibly additional procedures, but he'll have a chance at a relatively normal childhood." "And if it doesn't go well?" Wallace asked quietly. "He dies on the table or shortly after," I said. "I don't believe in sugarcoating that. You need to understand what you're agreeing to." Catherine reached for her husband's hand. Owen was playing with a model heart I kept on my desk, carefully rotating it to see all the chambers. "When could you do the surgery?" Wallace asked. "I have an opening next week, Tuesday morning. That would give us time to do a full cardiac catheterization on Monday to map out his exact anatomy." Wallace looked at his wife. She nodded. "We'll do it," Wallace said. "We trust you." I nodded. I'll have my coordinator work out the details with you. There are consent forms, pre-op instructions, all the logistics. I paused. Before you go, though, I wanted to ask you something. You seem familiar. Did you ever teach at Riverside High School? I watched his face change, saw the moment of confusion followed by a spark of recognition. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him mentally subtracting 20 years, trying to match my face to his memory of a 17-year-old kid. I did, he said slowly. For about 25 years. I left a few years ago to open my own theater studio. I thought so, I said. I went to Riverside. I was in your drama program, Small World. The recognition hit him fully. I could see it in his eyes, the sudden understanding of exactly who I was, the memory of what he'd said to me, what he'd done. His expression went through several rapid changes: surprise, embarrassment, something that might have been guilt. Yes, he said. I remember you. You were going to do pre-med, right? I'm glad that worked out. He was trying to smooth it over, to pretend the transition had been my choice. I smiled at him. It did work out, I said. Very well, actually. I gestured around my office at the evidence of my success. I'll see you Monday for the catheterization. My coordinator will be in touch. They left. I sat at my desk for a while after they were gone, feeling absolutely nothing except a distant sense of anticipation. The moment I'd imagined for 20 years was here, but not in any form I'd expected. I wasn't proving myself to Wallace by becoming famous or wealthy or powerful in some abstract way. I was going to save his son's life, and then I was going to make sure he knew that the person whose dream he'd destroyed was the only one who could give him back the thing he loved most. The week passed normally. I did other surgeries, saw other patients, maintained the routine that had governed my life for years. Monday came, and we did Owen's catheterization, a procedure where we inserted a thin tube into his blood vessels to map out the exact structure of his heart. The scans confirmed what I'd expected. The repair would be complex but possible. The kid's anatomy was challenging but not impossible. I met with Wallace and Catherine afterward to discuss the results. Wallace tried to catch my eye several times, clearly wanting to acknowledge the past, but I ignored him and spoke only to Catherine, explaining what we'd found and what the surgical plan would be. Tuesday morning arrived. I was in the OR by 6 a.m., reviewing the scans one more time while my team prepared. Owen was brought in at 7, already sedated. He looked impossibly small on the operating table, his chest barely rising and falling with each breath. I'd operated on hundreds of children. I never let myself think of them as individuals during surgery. It was the only way to maintain the focus and control the work required. But looking at Owen, I found myself thinking about Wallace, sitting in the waiting room, about Catherine pacing or praying or whatever she was doing to survive the next 8 hours. I thought about what would happen to them if I failed, if their son died because I couldn't execute the procedure correctly, and I thought about how easy it would be to fail. One wrong cut, one misplaced suture, one moment of carelessness, and Wallace would lose his child. I could make that happen, and no one would ever know it had been deliberate. Complications, I'd say. Sometimes these surgeries just don't work out. I felt absolutely nothing as I considered this possibility. Not temptation, not revulsion, just cold calculation. Could I do it? Would I? The answer was no, and I knew it immediately. Not because of morality or conscience or any of the things that should have stopped me. Simply because I was a surgeon, and surgeons saved lives. That was the entire foundation of what I'd built. If I abandoned that principle, even once, everything else became meaningless. I was going to save Owen Wallace because that was what I did, because I was capable of it, and because the revenge I wanted had nothing to do with the child's death. Let's begin, I said. The surgery took 9 hours. We opened Owen's chest and began the delicate work of repairing his heart. I reconstructed his pulmonary artery using a graft, repaired the ventricular septal defect, widened the narrowed pulmonary valve. Every movement had to be precise. One slip and I could nick a blood vessel, cause bleeding we couldn't control, damage tissue that couldn't be repaired. My hands never shook, my focus never wavered. I was aware of my team around me, the assisting surgeon, the nurses, the anesthesiologist monitoring Owen's vitals, but they were background noise. The only things that existed were the child's heart and my hands working to fix it. Around hour 6, we hit a complication. The pulmonary artery tissue was more fragile than the scans had suggested, and when I tried to attach the graft, it tore. Blood began pooling in the surgical field. "Suction," I said calmly. "I need better visualization." The nurse responded instantly, clearing the blood so I could see what I was working with. The tear wasn't catastrophic, but it needed to be repaired before I could continue with the primary procedure. I took a breath, selected a finer suture, and began stitching the damaged tissue with movements so small they were barely visible. It took 40 minutes to fix the tear. My back was screaming from standing in the same position for so long. My hands were starting to ache. But I couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to hand off to my assisting surgeon, because this particular repair required a level of precision that I wasn't sure anyone else on my team had. I finished the repair. The tissue held. We continued. By hour 8, we were closing up. Owen's new pulmonary artery was in place, his heart was repaired, and his vitals were stable. We'd done it. I'd done it. I closed the chest myself, making sure every layer was perfect, every suture exactly where it needed to be. When I finally stepped back from the table and stripped off my gloves, I felt the familiar exhaustion that came after a difficult surgery, but also something else, a grim satisfaction that had nothing to do with medical accomplishment. Owen was moved to the pediatric ICU. I went to the waiting room to update his parents. They'd been there for almost 10 hours, and it showed. Catherine looked like she hadn't slept in days. Wallace like he'd aged a decade. They both stood up when I walked in. I kept my expression neutral, professional. "The surgery went well," I said. "We had one complication with tissue integrity, but we were able to address it. Owen is stable. He'll be in the ICU for at least a week while we monitor his recovery, but barring any setbacks, he should make a full recovery." Catherine started crying. Wallace just nodded, looking like he might collapse from relief. "Can we see him?" Catherine asked. "Soon. He's still sedated and on a ventilator. We'll let you know when he's ready for visitors." I started to leave, but Wallace caught my arm. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough, emotional. "Thank you for saving my son." I looked down at his hand on my arm until he removed it. "It's my job," I said. "That's what I do." The next week, I monitored Owen's recovery closely. He was taken off the ventilator after 3 days and extubated successfully. By day 5, he was sitting up in bed and asking for his parents. By day 7, we moved him out of the ICU and into a regular room. I did rounds every day, checking his incision, reviewing his vitals, making sure there were no signs of infection or rejection. Wallace and Catherine were always there, taking turns staying overnight, one of them always at Owen's bedside. They thanked me constantly, effusively, with the kind of desperate gratitude that parents show to the doctors who save their children. Wallace tried several times to talk to me about Riverside, about the past. I deflected every time, keeping the conversation focused on Owen's medical care. I could see it frustrating him, this thing hanging between us, that he wanted to address, but I wasn't ready yet. 2 weeks after the surgery, Owen was discharged. I met with Wallace and Catherine one final time to go over the home care instructions, the follow-up appointment schedule, the warning signs to watch for. They sat across from me in my office, just like they had the first time, except now Owen was going to live. "We can't thank you enough," Catherine said. "You gave us our son back." "You'll need to bring him in monthly for the first year," I said. "After that, we can probably move to quarterly visits. He'll need to be monitored for the rest of his life, but if everything continues progressing as it has been, he should be able to do most normal activities by this time next year." "Remarkable," Wallace said quietly. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and apprehension. "You're an exceptional surgeon." "I'm competent," I said, deliberately echoing the word he'd used about my acting 20 years ago. "I've learned to be very good at what I do." There was a long pause. Catherine looked between us, sensing something but not understanding what. "I should go," Wallace said finally. "Catherine, why don't you bring the car around? I'll get Owen." Catherine left. Wallace stayed in his seat, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for what happened at Riverside. I should have encouraged you instead of what I did." "You told me I had a forgettable face," I said, "that I'd never make it as an actor, that I should give up and do something else." He flinched. "I was trying to be realistic, to save you from wasting years on something that might not work out. You sabotaged my college applications. You gave me a recommendation letter that made sure no theater program would accept me. I thought I was helping you avoid disappointment. You were protecting your favored student, Cameron Graham, who came from money and made your program look good. You crushed my dream so he could have opportunities that should have been mine." Wallace looked down at his hands. "You're right. I did favor certain students. I thought I was being strategic, building the program, but I was just playing favorites. And I'm sorry, I truly am." I studied him for a moment. The apology felt genuine, but it also felt cheap, easy. Sorry didn't change anything. Sorry didn't give me back the person I'd been before he destroyed my confidence and redirected my entire life. "I accept your apology," I said finally, "for what it's worth." Wallace looked relieved, like he'd been granted absolution. He stood up, extended his hand. I shook it. "I'm glad you found your calling," he said. "You're clearly brilliant at what you do. Everything worked out for the best." That phrase, "everything worked out for the best," triggered something cold in me. He actually believed that. He thought because I was successful now, because I'd saved his son, that somehow his actions had been justified. That crushing a teenager's dreams was fine, as long as that teenager eventually found something else to be good at. "Before you go," I said, "I want to make sure we're clear on something. I will continue treating Owen for as long as you need me to. I'll make sure he gets the best possible care. But after today, any communication between us will be strictly professional and will go through my coordinator. I don't want to see you outside of scheduled medical appointments. I don't want to have conversations that aren't directly related to your son's health. And when Owen is old enough to no longer need my care, I expect you to transfer him to another surgeon and never contact me again." Wallace stared at me. "I don't understand." "You destroyed my future because you decided I wasn't good enough. Now, your son's future depends entirely on my skill. I want you to live with that. Every time you look at Owen, every time he laughs or runs or does anything a healthy child does, I want you to remember that I'm the reason he can do those things. Not because I'm exceptional or brilliant, but because I'm competent. Because I learned to be very good at what I do, despite being told I'd never amount to anything." "You saved my son," Wallace said. "Doesn't that mean—" "It means I did my job. That's all. Now leave." He left. I sat in my office for a long time afterward, feeling hollowed out and somehow satisfied at the same time. I'd done what I'd set out to do. I'd proven Wallace wrong in the most absolute way possible. But the victory felt empty, mechanical, like I was going through motions I'd rehearsed so many times in my head that the actual execution didn't mean anything. 3 days later, Catherine Wallace called my office. My coordinator transferred the call to me. "Dr. Porter," Catherine said. She sounded hesitant, uncertain. "I was hoping I could speak with you privately, not about Owen's medical care, about something else." "What is it? Could we meet? For coffee, maybe? I know that's an unusual request, but I think there are things you should know. About Gregory." I hesitated. This felt like a complication I hadn't anticipated. "When?" "Tomorrow? There's a cafe near the hospital. I could meet you there at 11. I agreed before I could think better of it. The next morning, I found Catherine at a corner table, a cup of coffee already in front of her. She looked nervous, and I realized this was the first time I'd seen her without Wallace or Owen present. She was attractive in a subdued way, the kind of person who'd learned to make herself smaller, less noticeable. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as I sat down. "What is this about?" She took a breath. "After we left your office the other day, Gregory told me about Riverside, about what he did to you. He tried to present it as a misunderstanding, but I could tell there was more to it than he was saying. So I asked him to tell me the truth, all of it. And he did." She paused, looking down at her coffee. "He told me how he discouraged you from acting, gave you low grades, wrote a damaging recommendation letter. He told me about the student he favored instead, about why he did it. And as he was talking, I kept thinking about something that happened 2 years ago." "What happened?" "Gregory's theater studio wasn't doing well financially. He'd invested a lot of his own money into it, taken out loans. We were struggling. And then one of his former students, Cameron Graham, the one Gregory favored over you, came back to town. He'd become a successful commercial producer, had money to invest. Gregory asked him to help save the studio. I felt something tighten in my chest. Cameron said no," Catherine continued. "He said he'd moved on from that part of his life, that he didn't owe Gregory anything, and I watched my husband fall apart. He'd built his entire professional identity around being the mentor, the person who shaped young artists' careers. And when he actually needed help from one of those artists, he discovered they didn't feel any loyalty to him at all." She looked up at me. "Gregory never told me he'd actively sabotage students. He presented himself as someone who was honest and realistic with them, who tried to prevent them from wasting their lives on impossible dreams. But after hearing what he did to you, I started thinking about other students, other people he discouraged. How many talented kids never got a chance because my husband decided they weren't worth investing in?" "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I need you to understand something. When Gregory said you saved our son, he meant it. But I don't think he understood the full weight of what that means. You became extraordinary in spite of him. You saved Owen not because of anything Gregory did, but despite everything he did to try to destroy you. And now we owe our son's life to the person my husband tried to convince was worthless." She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "This is a letter I wrote to the school board at Riverside. I'm sending it tomorrow. It details what Gregory did to you and asks them to investigate whether other students were similarly mistreated. I thought you should know." I took the envelope, but didn't open it. "This will destroy his reputation." "Yes," Catherine said simply. "It will, and it should. I've been married to Gregory for 15 years. I thought I knew him. But the person who would sabotage a 17-year-old's dreams to protect his own ego, I don't know that person. I don't want to be married to that person." "What about Owen?" "Owen will be fine. We'll co-parent. He'll have 2 parents who love him, just not in the same house. And he'll grow up knowing that the surgeon who saved his life was someone his father wronged. Because I won't hide that from him. When he's old enough to understand, he'll know." She stood up. "Thank you again for saving my son, Dr. Porter. And I'm sorry for everything Gregory took from you." She left before I could respond. I sat there with the envelope for a long time. Eventually, I opened it and read the letter Catherine had written. It was detailed, measured, devastating. She outlined exactly what Wallace had done, named specific incidents, and requested a formal investigation into his conduct during his time at Riverside. The letter would end his career. The theater studio he'd built would collapse. His reputation in the local arts community would be destroyed. Everything he'd built for himself would unravel, and he'd be left with nothing but the knowledge that he'd brought it all on himself. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. 2 weeks later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Catherine Wallace had filed for divorce. She'd moved out, taking Owen with her. Wallace was living alone in their house, dealing with the fallout of Catherine's letter to the school board, which had triggered an investigation. Former students were coming forward, sharing their own stories of being discouraged, undermined, passed over for roles or recommendations. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd built his career by crushing students who didn't fit his vision or threatened his control, while elevating the ones who made him look good. The investigation concluded that while Wallace's actions didn't constitute formal misconduct, he'd never done anything technically against policy. They represented a pattern of behavior incompatible with the values of the school district. His name was removed from the theater wing he'd endowed. The scholarships established in his honor were renamed. His legacy at Riverside was systematically erased. His theater studio closed 6 months later. Without Catherine's income, and with his reputation destroyed, he couldn't maintain it. I continued treating Owen. Catherine brought him to his monthly appointments, and we developed a professional rapport. She never asked me about my feelings toward her ex-husband, and I never volunteered them. Owen was a sweet kid, recovering beautifully, with no memory of the surgery or understanding of the complicated history between his mother's ex-husband and his surgeon. When Owen was 7, Catherine started dating someone else, a graphic designer she worked with, a quiet man who seemed genuinely kind. I met him at one of Owen's appointments and approved. Owen needed stability, normalcy, people in his life who weren't defined by old wounds or revenge. I rarely thought about Gregory Wallace anymore. Occasionally, I'd hear updates through the medical community grapevine. He'd taken a job teaching drama at a community college 2 hours away, was living in a small apartment, had apparently lost a significant amount of weight, and looked perpetually exhausted. The last I heard, he was still teaching, still trying to rebuild some version of his former life, but the energy was gone. He looked like a man who'd lost everything that mattered and couldn't figure out how it had happened. I should have felt satisfied. This was the revenge I'd imagined for 20 years. Wallace left with nothing, his reputation destroyed, his family gone, forced to live with the knowledge that he'd brought it all on himself. And it had happened not through any deliberate action on my part, but simply because I'd been good enough at my job to save his son, and honest enough about the past to trigger Catherine's investigation into who her husband really was. But I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel much of anything. I was 42 years old, one of the most respected pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country, with a success rate that exceeded national averages and a list of publications that other surgeons envied. I'd built exactly the life I'd set out to build after Wallace destroyed my acting dreams. A life of measurable achievement, undeniable expertise, and complete emotional control. I lived alone. I worked constantly. I had colleagues who respected me and patients who trusted me, but no real friends, no intimate relationships, no connection to anything except my work. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed genuinely or felt joy that wasn't just the brief satisfaction of a successful surgery. The theater kid I'd been at 17, the one who cried during powerful performances, who believed in the transformative power of art, who thought the highest purpose in life was making people feel something. That person was completely gone. I'd killed him as thoroughly as Wallace had tried to, except I'd been more effective at it. I'd won. I'd proven Wallace wrong in every possible way. I'd saved his son, destroyed his marriage, ended his career, and outlived his cruelty by becoming exceptional at something he couldn't touch or diminish. But the cost of that victory was everything I'd once been, everything I'd once wanted to be. I'd spent 25 years building armor so thick that nothing could hurt me, and in the process, I'd made it impossible for anything to reach me at all. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I thought about what might have happened if Wallace had encouraged me instead of crushing me. Maybe I would have become an actor. Maybe I would have struggled and failed and eventually given up anyway. Maybe his assessment of my talent had been accurate, and I really didn't have what it took to make it in theater. But I would have failed on my own terms. I would have tried and discovered my limits naturally, rather than having them imposed on me by someone who decided I wasn't worth the investment. I might have ended up in medicine anyway, but I would have chosen it freely rather than fleeing to it as a refuge from humiliation. I would have been a different person, someone less controlled, less isolated, less defined by the need to prove something to a man, who'd stopped thinking about me the day I left his classroom. That was the real revenge, I realized. Not what I'd done to Wallace, but what he'd done to me. He'd taken a passionate, open-hearted kid and turned him into someone who measured value only in achievements, who couldn't trust anyone, who'd spent decades building a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow at its core. I'd won the war, but lost myself in the process, and unlike Wallace, who could at least tell himself he'd been trying to help, I had made my choices deliberately, understanding exactly what I was sacrificing and doing it anyway. I saved Owen Wallace because I was a surgeon, and that's what surgeons did. But I'd also saved him because I wanted Gregory Wallace to spend the rest of his life knowing that his son lived, because of the person he'd tried to destroy. I wanted him to feel the weight of that debt every time he looked at Owen, to understand that he owed everything, his son's life, his son's future, his son's happiness, to someone he'd deemed forgettable and worthless. And I got what I wanted. Wallace lost his wife, his career, his reputation, and his comfortable life. He was left alone with the knowledge that he'd brought it all on himself through his own cruelty and arrogance. But I'd lost something too. I'd lost the ability to care about that victory, to feel anything real about it beyond a distant sense of completion. I'd built my entire adult life around proving Wallace wrong, and now that I had, I discovered that the proof meant nothing because there was no one left inside me who cared about being proven right. I was exceptional at what I did. I saved lives that other surgeons couldn't save. I had the respect of my peers and the gratitude of hundreds of families. By any objective measure, my life was a success. But I was 42 years old, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd wanted anything, except to be left alone with my work. I couldn't remember what it felt like to dream about something beyond proving I was competent. I'd spent so long becoming someone who couldn't be hurt that I'd become someone who couldn't feel much of anything at all. That was the real cost of revenge. Not the time it took or the effort it required, but the person you had to become in order to achieve it. I'd turned myself into someone capable of saving a child's life without flinching, of destroying a man's career without hesitation, of watching my victory unfold without feeling satisfaction or regret, or anything except cold recognition that I'd accomplished what I set out to do. I'd won. Gregory Wallace had lost. And neither of those facts mattered anymore, because the person who'd cared enough to want revenge was gone, replaced by someone who only understood success and failure, competence and incompetence, the precise execution of difficult procedures, and the maintenance of professional distance. Sometimes I wondered if Wallace knew what he'd really done to me, not just the immediate damage of crushing my dreams, but the long-term transformation of turning me into this. Someone who measured everything in terms of power and achievement, who couldn't trust or connect or feel genuine emotion because emotion made you vulnerable, and vulnerability meant someone could hurt you. He'd told me I had a forgettable face. He'd been wrong about that. Patients remembered me. Families requested me specifically. My name was known in pediatric cardiac surgery circles across the country. But in a deeper way, he'd been right. The person I'd been was forgettable because I'd forgotten him myself, buried him under years of discipline and control and the absolute refusal to want anything I couldn't achieve through skill alone. I'd proven I could be exceptional despite him. I'd saved his son and destroyed his life and emerged objectively superior in every measurable way. And all of it, every achievement, every success, every moment of proving him wrong, had been completely, devastatingly empty, because at the end of it all, Gregory Wallace was just a man who'd made cruel choices and paid for them, and I was just someone who'd built a successful career while losing the ability to care whether success meant anything beyond the numbers on a resume. I'd won the war, but there was no one left inside me who remembered what we'd been fighting for. Stories like this happen more often than we think. Subscribe if you want to hear the ones that usually stay unspoken. And if this story made you pause, a like helps the channel grow.